My name is Nora Ellison. I'm 34 years old, and before I owned a manor with iron gates and stone walls in a quiet Vermont town, I spent the better part of my life perfecting the art of pretending that what my family did to me every Christmas was not really what it was. My mother had a particular talent for making me disappear without ever saying the words out loud. No dramatic scenes, no declarations, just a missing seat at the table, a gift clearly bought in a rush, if one arrived at all, and a polite explanation about how everyone had assumed I was busy, or tired, or working, as if I had somehow chosen to walk out of my own place in the family portrait. For years, I accepted those explanations. I filed them under miscommunication, under imperfect people, under that is just how families work sometimes. I kept showing up, kept bringing gifts, kept performing the role of the gracious daughter who did not require too much maintenance. Last Christmas was the year that performance ended. I drove 5 hours through freezing rain with a trunk full of carefully chosen, expensive presents. I had planned the journey for weeks. I had thought, as I always thought, that this time it would be different. The house was glowing when I arrived. Warm light in the windows, music I could hear from the driveway, laughter that had clearly been happening for some time. When the door opened, the person who should have been relieved to see me looked at me instead with an expression that was equal parts surprise and irritation, as though I had shown up uninvited to a celebration that had never really included me. I stood on that step in the cold, holding bags in both hands, and something in me went still in a way I had never quite felt before. Not the burning quiet of swallowed anger, but the deep, final quiet of a decision being made without fanfare. I had driven 5 hours in freezing rain to be looked at like an inconvenience. That was the last time. So I made one. I drove home. I cried once, which felt appropriate. Then I started planning. By the following spring, I had changed my phone number, locked down every account my family might use to find me, redirected my mail through a private box 2 towns over, and dissolved my digital presence down to almost nothing. At work in Boston, I kept my life deliberately unremarkable. I showed up, I did my job, I came home, and I spent my evenings building the one thing I had never had inside that family, a plan that belonged entirely to me. The manor came into my life the way good things sometimes do, quietly, buried in a listing most people would have scrolled past. The house sat on a hill outside a small town called Evergreen Hollow in Vermont, wrapped in old stone and dense silence, with iron gates at the entrance and enough land around it to make the rest of the world feel genuinely far away. The locals called it Blackthorn Manor, and it sat within a historic preservation district, which meant it carried layers of legal protection most buyers would have considered a headache. I considered it armor. I purchased it through a trust structure specifically designed to put distance between my name and anything my family might one day decide to reach for. By December, the house was mine to live in, and I was ready to live in it on my own terms. I thought that would be enough. Distance, paperwork, locked gates, and a new address nobody had. I thought I had built something clean enough to finally be left alone in. I was wrong, because the moment they discovered I had something beautiful, something valuable, something they could use, they remembered me all at once. And when they came to my gate, they didn't come with apologies. They came with a locksmith, a forged document, and a plan that would have destroyed me if I had still been the woman they thought I was. 3 days before Christmas, I drove up to Blackthorn with a car packed with groceries, books, candles, and enough good wine to last a full week without apology. I remember standing in the front hallway on that first evening, listening to the quiet settle over the old house the way snow settles, slowly, completely, without asking permission. No one interrupting me, no one asking what I had brought for Logan, no one suggesting I be more patient, more gracious, more willing to be the bigger person, as if being chronically overlooked were a character-building exercise I had volunteered for. For the first time in my adult life, silence did not feel like punishment. It felt chosen. I walked through every room slowly that first night, running my fingers along old wood and cold stone, letting myself imagine a Christmas that began and ended entirely on my terms. I lit the library fireplace. I opened a bottle of wine. I sat in a leather chair and watched the flames until I noticed something almost embarrassing. I felt safe. Not cautiously safe, not temporarily safe, genuinely, quietly, structurally safe. That feeling was so unfamiliar it made me laugh out loud in an empty room. For the first time in my adult life, silence did not feel like punishment. It felt chosen. I should have known that kind of peace would not go unchallenged, because while I was building a life no one in my family had earned the right to enter, my mother had already started asking questions. She had already begun telling people I was isolating myself, that I had become secretive and difficult, that she was worried. She was, in other words, laying the groundwork for the story she planned to tell about me, the kind of story designed to make people stop trusting a woman before she ever gets the chance to speak. That had always been her sharpest weapon. She never needed to shout or strike. She simply needed to tell her version of events first. And she had been doing it for as long as I could remember. The quiet, elegant narrative of a concerned mother and a troubled daughter. The kind of story that gets sympathy in church foyers and at school gates and in the comments sections of Facebook posts. What she was building, without my knowing, was permission. Permission for what came next. Logan was my brother, or rather my mother's son from a later relationship, which made him technically my half-sibling and practically a stranger with preferential treatment baked in from the beginning. He was charming in the way people are when charm is their primary financial strategy, and he had spent the better part of 3 years building an online following around curated lifestyle content. Beautiful homes, tasteful Christmas decorations, the aesthetic of a life he had never actually managed to afford. He had discovered the manor the same way he found most things he wanted without paying for them, through a combination of surveillance and laziness on someone else's part. A tagged photograph in a local heritage archive, a piece of distinctive stonework, a cross-reference with a property listing. Logan had reverse engineered my address, like a man who had always believed other people's privacy was an inconvenience aimed specifically at him. He told my mother told my father, Richard, and the three of them, pooling their individual brands of entitlement, had put together what they apparently believed was a workable plan. I was alone. The house was large. The location was remote. I had spent years being managed, and they assumed those years had made me manageable. They had a fake agreement, a practiced performance, and a locksmith on standby. They believed they knew exactly which version of me would be standing on the other side of those iron gates. They arrived on the afternoon of December 23rd. I heard the engines before I saw the cars. 2 dark SUVs and a locksmith van coming up a road that led almost nowhere in weather that made the effort deliberate. I kept the lights off. I moved to the front window, and I watched them pull into view with the very specific calm of a woman who has learned that panic is a luxury she cannot afford. My first feeling looking at those vehicles was not fear, it was insult. They had not called, they had not apologized, they had not come to say they missed me. They had brought tools. My mother stepped out of the first SUV in a cream wool coat that looked like she had dressed for a holiday portrait rather than a trespass. Behind her came Richard, already wearing the tired, reasonable expression he used whenever he needed strangers to believe he was the responsible adult in any given situation. Logan climbed out of the second vehicle, still talking into his phone, then immediately began unloading flat-pack display stands and storage bins from the back. That detail told me more than any speech could have. They were not here to visit. They were here to install themselves. I walked down to the gate and stopped on my side of the iron bars. My mother smiled at me in that pained, delicate way she reserved for moments when she wanted an audience to believe she was suffering nobly. "Nora," she said, as if this were all perfectly simple, Open the gate, sweetheart. It is freezing. I asked the only question that actually mattered. How did you find me? Richard sighed before she could answer. Slowly, deliberately, in the way of a man who has decided to enjoy himself. Logan found a tagged photograph online, he said. He cross-referenced the stonework with the preservation archive. You really should have been more careful. There was something so composed about how he said it, as though violating my privacy was simply evidence that I had failed some basic intelligence test. Not your home like that, Nora. Underneath every lie my family ever told, there was always the same belief. Nothing that belonged to me really counted as mine if they decided they wanted it. My mother moved closer to the gate. She said, "We were worried about you. Spending Christmas alone in a place this size isn't healthy. We thought family should be together." I almost laughed. Family had never needed to be together during any of the years when I was the one being left outside. Then Logan stepped forward with a folded document in one hand and the expression of a man who believes he has already won. "Good news," he said. "We solved the space issue." He pressed the paperwork against the bar so I could read it. It was styled as a shared residential use agreement with language about guest swing access, family holiday overflow, event hosting rights, and long-term occupancy protections. At the bottom was a version of my signature, close enough to sting, sloppy enough to reveal exactly how careless their confidence was. My stomach dropped, not because I believed for a single moment it would survive legal scrutiny, but because I understood immediately what the strategy actually was. Get inside first, manufacture a scene second, then force me into a slow and expensive legal dispute, while Logan quietly transformed my home into a set for whatever online venture he was currently monetizing. The forgery was not the weapon, the occupation was. "This is fake," I said. My mother dabbed at the corner of one perfectly dry eye and turned just slightly toward the locksmith, making sure he could see the profile that had earned her sympathy from neighbors, churchwomen, and caterers for 30 years. "She's confused," she said softly. "She has been under so much stress. We are only trying to help her." The locksmith shifted. Richard took his opening. "We have an agreement and a family situation," he said in the low professional tone that had been getting him out of responsibility his entire life. "She gets overwhelmed. We're only trying to settle in quietly." Then Logan nodded toward the gate keypad. The locksmith stepped forward with his drill. It was that casual, that certain. They did not even maintain the pretense for long. They had expected me to panic, to start shouting, to become the unstable woman my mother had already described to anyone who might eventually be asked about this afternoon. Instead, I took my phone out of my coat pocket, and I started recording. My mother's smile faltered for the first time. "What are you doing, Nora?" I kept the camera steady, on the drill, on the van logo, on Logan's face, on Richard holding the forged document like it was already sufficient. "Building a timeline," I said, and for one brief, beautiful second, all three of them looked at me in a way I had never seen before, like they had just realized I was no longer the daughter who stood at doors, waiting to be let in. The deputy arrived just as the locksmith pressed the drill to the gate control box. I had called the moment the tool came out, and for one brief, hopeful second, I thought the law might move quickly enough to settle this cleanly. That hope evaporated in approximately 40 seconds. Deputy Mason Cole was young, cold, and visibly irritated before he even stepped out of his cruiser. He surveyed the scene, me at the gate, 2 expensive SUVs in the drive, a locksmith van, and 3 adults in winter coats presenting a composed, coordinated front, and I could see him deciding in real time how much effort he wanted to spend on what he had already categorized as a wealthy family disagreement. My mother moved first, as she always did. She approached him with exactly the right amount of trembling in her voice. "Deputy, thank God," she said. "Our daughter has shut herself away and she's not well. We've been trying to reach her for weeks." Richard handed over the forged paperwork with the weary expression of a man implying he had done everything correctly and I had forced this unpleasant scene. Logan stood in the background with the bins and rolled his eyes in the practiced manner of someone who has spent years signaling to adults that a difficult woman was once again making everyone's life harder. I stayed exactly where I was. I stated my name clearly. I said I was the lawful resident. I said they did not have permission to enter. I said the signature on the agreement was forged. The deputy glanced at the papers, glanced at me, and then made the same mistake so many people had made when my family and I were in the same room. He listened to the calmer liar. Rejected, as if neglect were an emotion I had invented, rather than a pattern she had spent decades building. My mother lowered her voice and said a version of the sentence she had used about me my entire life. She gets like this when she feels rejected. She thinks everything is an attack. Rejected, as if neglect were an emotion I had invented, rather than a pattern she had spent decades building. The deputy gave me the look that gets directed at women who are inconvenienced but articulate. Ma'am, if there's paperwork and a dispute over its validity, this may be a civil matter. Civil, as if a forged agreement, a drill, and a planned occupation were a misunderstanding with better winter coats. Richard saw the opening immediately. "We are not trying to remove her," he said. "We are trying to support the family's use of the property. Logan needs temporary space for a holiday content business he is launching, and Nora had agreed before she started pulling away again." That was the moment the real motive announced itself without disguise. A holiday content business. That explained the display stands, the storage bins, the lighting cases still in the back of the SUV. Logan had not come to stay quietly in a spare room. He had come to turn my house into a backdrop he could monetize while my mother played gracious hostess and my father called the whole arrangement helping. I looked at Logan directly, phone still recording. "Are you trying to run commercial events out of my home?" He smirked. "It's not your home like that, Nora." That sentence stayed with me long after everything else that day had faded. Not your home like that. Because underneath every lie my family had ever told, there was always the same foundational belief. Nothing that belonged to me truly counted as mine if they decided they wanted it badly enough. The deputy told everyone to keep the peace and stopped short of removing them. He did not grant them permission, but he did something almost worse. He created ambiguity, and ambiguity is precisely the thing selfish people live on. The moment he steps back toward his cruiser, Logan began placing a call, dictating my address to someone, using the words transfer service and seasonal business use. That was when I called Elena Vargas. Elena Vargas picked up on the second ring. I gave her the facts in the fastest, flattest voice I had. Forged occupancy agreement, attempted forced entry, preservation district property, active police presence, commercial activity being arranged on my address without my consent. Elena did not waste a single second pretending this was ordinary. "Nora," she said, "do not let them bait you into a screaming match. Record everything. Ask the deputy to verify title ownership, not just residency paperwork. And if Logan is using this property for commercial activity, he is about to bury himself." I looked at my family, the bins, the fake concern, the careful performance, and for the first time that afternoon, I felt something steadier than anger. I felt structure. They had arrived believing I was alone and unprotected. What they had actually done was step into a system of evidence, zoning regulation, and trust law that none of them had bothered to understand. Elena did not come in person that afternoon. She did something better. She called the deputy directly, then emailed certified title documents to his department while I stood at the gate in the cold, watching my family perform innocence beside a locksmith van. What followed changed the atmosphere of that driveway the way a pressure shift changes weather, slowly, then all at once. 10 minutes after Elena's call, the deputy walked back toward the gate with a different posture, stiffer, more careful. He asked Richard to hand over the agreement again. Then he asked the question my father had clearly never prepared for. "Concern does not arrive with a drill, Elena Vargas. If your daughter signed this as owner, why is title held by the Blackthorn Heritage Residential Trust? Richard blinked. Logan stopped moving. My mother lost her expression for a half second before she reconstructed it. The deputy continued in the careful, flattened tone of someone who has realized they nearly became part of something illegal. Miss Ellison is the resident beneficiary and trustee occupant. She is not individually titled, the way this document claims. That means your agreement has a serious validity problem before we even examine the alleged signature. Elena joined the conversation on speakerphone, and listening to her dismantle them was, I will admit, almost luxurious. She explained that no one present had authority to create private occupancy rights against the trust in the way the document attempted. She explained that any planned commercial use in a historic preservation district without proper board approval would trigger multiple violations. She explained that if Logan had already initiated utility or business service transfers using my personal identifying information, the matter had moved well beyond a holiday disagreement. My mother tried to interrupt with something about family generosity and genuine concern. Elena cut clean through it. Concern, she said, does not arrive with a drill. For a moment, nobody in that driveway said a single word. The deputy finally told them to leave the premises and stop unloading property from their vehicles. Logan protested first, naturally, claiming I had promised him space, that this was harassment, that I was deliberately sabotaging a professional launch. My father attempted the respectable man routine one final time, suggesting this could surely be resolved privately. But there was nothing private left. My phone had all of it, the deputy had all of it, Elena had all of it. My mother stepped forward and hissed my name in a voice calibrated to be heard by me and not by the deputy standing 5 meters away. You are humiliating us. That word almost made me laugh. The idea that humiliation had only just arrived in our family dynamic, rather than having sat quietly beside me at every Christmas dinner for the last 2 decades. They started packing up, but not with the body language of people accepting defeat. They moved like people carefully storing rage for a later date. Logan shoved bins into the SUV hard enough to crack one. Richard folded the forged paperwork with hands that were not entirely steady. My mother said nothing further to me in front of the deputy, which told me exactly what I needed to know. She was already composing the next version of the story. They drove away before sunset. I watched until the taillights disappeared through the trees. Then I locked the gate, walked back to the house, and stood in the front hallway with a particular kind of exhaustion that feels less like tiredness and more like a chemical change in the body. Something had shifted, and I was not naive enough to believe they had finished. Inside, I checked the front camera feed. Static. Then the side entrance feed went dark as well. Logan had done something on the way out, most likely at the cable junction by the stone column near the drive. He had not cut the power. He had done something more intentional. He had blinded the 2 cameras that would have mattered most if they returned at dark. A few minutes later, my phone rang from the utility company, asking me to confirm a service update request I had never made. Logan had already attempted to shift part of my account structure, using fragments of information only someone with access to old family records could have. Social security numbers, previous addresses, security prompts from accounts I had set up years earlier. My skin went cold in a way the winter outside could not account for. They had not come to Blackthorn because they loved me. They had come because I had finally built something far enough outside their control that the only way they could live with it was to take it. That kind of desperation does not leave quietly. It circles. It returns with better tools and less patience. By the following morning, my mother had done exactly what I had known she would. A cousin I had not spoken to in years sent me a screenshot before breakfast. My mother had posted publicly that she and Richard had made the long drive to Evergreen Hollow to check on their isolated daughter, only to find me confused, aggressive, and hiding alone in a dark historic house after weeks of concerning behavior. The comments were exactly what you would expect. Prayers for the family. She always seemed troubled. Some children simply cannot appreciate what their parents sacrifice. I read every single line. I did not reply to any of them. I took screenshots of all of it and saved the folder under one word: defamation. That was the clearest difference between the woman I was now and the woman I had been for most of my adult life. I no longer argued with lies in the moment. I archived them instead. Around 10 the next morning, Logan tried a different angle. He submitted a vendor inquiry for a seasonal event permit using my address and a slightly mangled version of my legal name, almost certainly hoping to establish a paper trail, suggesting commercial operations had already begun at the property before anyone could stop them. That was when the full shape of their plan locked into place for me. Logan was drowning financially and needed a prestigious holiday venue immediately. My mother wanted the social currency of a beautifully staged family Christmas with herself as the face of warmth and tradition. My father wanted the entire arrangement framed as cooperative family use so that no one would ask too closely where the authority had come from or why the house was being used at all. They were not trying to take shelter. They were trying to take narrative space and legitimacy in a single coordinated move. And they had every reason to believe I would be too emotionally shaken, too concerned about appearances, or too exhausted by the legal process to stop them in time. They had forgotten that I had spent 34 years learning exactly what they were capable of, and I had spent the last 8 months preparing accordingly. Elena called just before noon on Christmas Eve and confirmed what I had already suspected. If they returned and attempted staged entry again, particularly with commercial materials or false authority documents, we could consolidate everything into a far stronger criminal and civil package. The first visit had given us evidence of intent. A second visit would give us repetition. And repetition, in the eyes of the law, removed all plausible deniability. June Mercer from the local paper returned my email that same morning. She was not sensationalist about it, just careful and precise. She said the forged agreement, the utility fraud attempt, the preservation district implications, and the documented social media defamation made this more than a private family dispute, provided I could demonstrate intent and pattern of conduct. I told her I believed I could. Then I made the decision that changed the shape of how the story would end. I stopped thinking like a daughter trying to protect her peace. I started thinking like someone setting conditions. Through Harold Whitmore at the local Heritage Society, I arranged a small gathering under the Trust's permitted residential heritage hospitality guidelines, language dull enough on paper to attract no attention and strong enough in practice to place credible, respected witnesses inside the house. No public announcement, no social media trail, just a handful of invited locals, Harold himself, 2 preservation board members, a reporter, my attorney on standby, and a retired locksmith named Caleb Dunn, who had spent 30 years in the trade and could identify attempted forced access the way a doctor reads an X-ray. The point was not a party. The point was witnesses that my family could not outmaneuver with charm or performance. I also arranged private security through Elena's professional network, Officer Reed working a private detail, with a deputy from the local department briefed and positioned close enough to move the moment entry crossed from attempted to actual. By late afternoon on Christmas Eve, the house looked dark from the road on purpose, curtains drawn, exterior lights off, no visible sign of life. From the outside, it looked exactly like what they wanted it to look like, an empty stage waiting for them to walk onto it. Inside, it was different. Lamps glowed in the library and dining room. Harold and the preservation board members sat with mulled wine, discussing plaster restoration in voices so calm it felt almost dreamlike. June was positioned near the front hall, where she could observe without becoming part of what she was covering. Caleb stood at the back corridor window with the posture of a man already personally offended by whatever fool thought that old stone houses were easy to breach. Officer Porter waited deeper in the house. A deputy waited outside, close enough to reach the front door in 30 seconds. I stood in the foyer in a black dress I had selected for one reason and one reason only. I wanted to look like a woman who belonged entirely in her own home. 7 came and went. I will admit there was a moment, around 1:15, where I wondered whether they had finally found caution, whether the earlier confrontation had been enough to make them recalculate, whether perhaps I had over-prepared for a threat that had retreated. Then, at exactly 17:14, the motion sensor on the outer drive pinged my phone. Headlights off, slow movement. A rental truck behind the second SUV. Not subtle anymore, not even attempting the veneer of a concerned family welfare call. They had brought transport, additional equipment, and the kind of purposeful momentum that belongs to people who have already talked themselves into believing they cannot be stopped. My mother had forgotten me at every Christmas table until I bought a manor. Now she was coming up my driveway on Christmas Eve with tools and a plan, and the absolute unshakable certainty that the dark house ahead of her was empty. She was about to discover the difference between empty and waiting. From the front window, I watched them come up the drive without headlights. That detail alone told me everything I needed to know about how innocent they understood themselves to be. Logan jumped out first this time, carrying a crowbar and wearing the wild, cornered energy of a man who has run out of softer methods. Richard followed, holding a folder thick enough to suggest another document performance was planned. My mother stepped out last, in a dark coat, hair done, makeup immaculate, because even standing at the edge of a felony, she wanted to look impeccable doing it. The second locksmith was younger than the first and carried himself with the specific nervousness of someone who has arrived too late to the realization that another person's family emergency might actually constitute a crime. No one inside the house moved toward the door. That was the essential discipline of what we had built that evening. We let them prove their intentions without any interruption. Through the old wood and stone walls, we heard everything clearly. Logan saying, "Just break the side glass if the lock bites you." Richard telling the locksmith they held power of attorney and the right to intervene. My mother raising her voice to a register calibrated for anyone nearby who might be listening. "Nora, sweetheart, open the door. We are here because we love you." There was no love in the crowbar that hit my front lock seconds later. The first blow rang through the foyer with a sound so sharp and decisive that even Harold and the preservation board members, who had been speaking quietly in the dining room, went completely still. The second blow splintered the doorframe. Cold air pushed in through the gap. The younger locksmith drilled while Logan cried, and Richard gave instructions. And then the old door gave way with a violent crack that sounded less like wood breaking and more like something running out of patience. Logan stumbled through first, breathing hard, crowbar still in his hand. For one full second, triumph was written clearly on his face. He was already inside. He had forced the thing open. He believed he had won. Then the lights came up. Not every lamp in the house, just enough. Enough to illuminate 3 people in the foyer holding a crowbar, a drill, and forged paperwork above a ruined lock and a broken frame. Enough for them to notice me standing at the foot of the staircase in a black dress, entirely calm. Enough for them to notice June Mercer lifting her phone to record. Enough to catch sight of Harold Whitmore and the preservation board members framed in the dining room doorway, wearing the expressions of people who have just watched someone take a crowbar to a church altar. Enough for them to notice Caleb Dunn step forward from the corridor and say, with total disgust, "That is forced entry." Enough for Officer Reed Porter to emerge from the hallway. Enough for Deputy Mason, not the same uncertain young man from the previous afternoon, but a different deputy who had been fully briefed, to step in right behind him. Flashlights hit their faces fast and hard. Hands where I can see them, now." Logan froze. My father did not. He tried one last pivot, waving the folder, talking rapidly. "We have authority. She is not stable. We are family. She is isolating. We have the right." Officer Porter did not glance at the folder. "Family," he said, "does not get to break into a protected residence with burglary tools." Logan lowered the crowbar with the careful slowness of someone remembering for the first time that metal has weight and consequences. My mother stared at me, and the look on her face, past the performance, past the calculation, past everything she had constructed over 30 years, was pure, undisguised fury. "You set us up," she whispered. "No," I said. "I documented you." Elena stepped forward then, calm as a snowfall, measured as a closing argument, and took the folder from Richard's hand. She reviewed it briefly with the expression of someone identifying a familiar species of fraud. Fake emergency authority, invalid on its face, wrong execution standard, wrong witness structure, wrong property relationship. She paused. "You all committed a felony with paperwork you downloaded from the internet." June almost smiled at that. She did not stop recording. My mother shifted tactics immediately, as she always had when one performance failed. She began to cry, loudly, beautifully, with the practiced physical precision of someone who has used tears as currency for most of her adult life. Under different circumstances, in a different room, with a different audience, it would have worked perfectly. People would have looked at the weeping mother and the cold daughter and drawn the conclusion she needed them to draw. But this audience had context. June had the Facebook post. Elena had the forged agreement and the utility fraud trail. Caleb had witnessed the first visit and knew exactly what kind of access job had been attempted. Harold had personally seen the commercial equipment unloaded 2 days earlier and understood precisely what Logan had been planning to do to a preservation district property. People who come to talk do not bring crowbars. My father made one final attempt at authority. "This has gone too far," he said. "Nora, tell them we only came to talk." I looked at him, at the man who had spent my entire life making himself the reasonable presence in every unreasonable situation, who had allowed all of this to happen by lending it the legitimacy of his presence, and I said the most accurate thing I had said all evening. "People who come to talk do not bring crowbars." Officer Porter moved toward Logan first. Logan panicked in exactly the way guilty people panic when consequences finally catch up with the speed of their decisions. He turned toward the broken door as if escape were still an option. The deputy caught him before it reached it. The crowbar hit the marble floor with a sound that seemed to echo in every room of the house at once. Handcuffs closed on Logan's wrists. My father protested, then protested harder when Officer Porter told him to turn around. The deputy listed the charges in the flat, methodical voice of law enforcement: conspiracy, trespass, forced entry, forged instruments, attempted fraudulent occupation, with a particular absence of emotion that strips a person of every story they have ever told themselves. Richard looked genuinely stunned, in the specific way of a man for whom consequences have always been something that happened to other people in other kinds of families. My mother stood alone in the center of the ruined foyer, the broken door behind her, the witnesses around her, and when it became clear that her tears had found no purchase in this particular room, she reached for the only other tool she had left. She stepped toward me and said, low enough to be intimate and cruel, the sentence she had deployed my entire life when she wanted to end an argument by making me feel guilty for having one. "After everything I did for you, this is how you repay me?" I took one step closer. The house was warm at my back. Snow was blowing in through the broken doorframe, and for the first time in my life, I heard those words for exactly what they were. Not a statement of love, not a claim of sacrifice, but evidence of a woman who could only remember I existed when she wanted access to something I owned. "Everything you ever did for me had a receipt attached. Love does not break in. Love does not forge signatures. Love does not wait until Christmas to discover whether a house can be turned into income." Officer Porter told her to turn around. She did, slowly, in the disbelief of someone who has never once had to consider that the universe might not recognize her version of herself. When the handcuffs closed on her wrists, the sound was smaller than I had expected. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just precise. That was what made it satisfying. Not revenge as spectacle, revenge as accuracy. One by one, they were walked out past the stone columns, past the broken threshold they had created with their own tools, past the witnesses they had not been able to charm, and toward the waiting cruisers at the end of the drive. Logan cried first. My mother kept asking for a private conversation. My father said almost nothing once he realized that looking reasonable no longer produced the results it always had. June stayed long enough to confirm timelines and statements. Alina made sure every piece of documentation was properly transmitted before the night was over. Caleb and Harold left quietly, without drama, in the manner of people who had come to do a specific job and done it. The temporary board fixed over the broken door kept most of the cold out, though not all of it. And then they were gone. All of them. And the house was mine again in the way it had been on that very first evening, completely, fully, without condition. I stood alone in the great hall beside the Christmas tree I had decorated 3 days earlier, with a glass of wine in my hand and the quiet I had driven 5 hours through freezing rain to find, finally returning around me. Not the fragile quiet of someone holding their breath, the real kind, the kind that stays. Peace is not selfish, evidence is not cold, and protecting yourself from people who keep wounding you is not a betrayal of love. What followed in the days and weeks after was, in its own way, as satisfying as the night itself, though quieter. Logan's pending business partnerships dissolved within a week. Vendors withdrew. The online accounts connected to his holiday venture were reported and suspended. My father, who had built so much of her public identity around being seen as gracious, warm, and above reproach, had to live in a town that now understood exactly what her tears had always been worth. The local story was no longer about a concerned family and their troubled daughter. It was about a planned takeover of a protected historic property, a forged occupancy agreement, an identity theft attempt, and a carefully constructed defamation campaign that had collapsed completely under the weight of evidence and witnesses. I do not tell this story as a celebration of their suffering. Suffering on its own teaches nothing. What I hope this story communicates is something more specific, something that took me 34 years and one very cold December night to understand fully. Some people will call your boundary cruelty because your obedience used to benefit them. Some people will call your evidence paranoia because their story requires you to be unstable. Some people will describe your silence as abandonment, when in fact, it is the first thing you have ever done purely for yourself. And they will say all of this with absolute conviction because they have been saying versions of it for so long, they have stopped knowing the difference between what is true and what is useful. I was raised to believe that family meant access, meant forgiveness without limit, meant explaining yourself indefinitely to people who had already decided how to use the explanation. But family without genuine respect does not remain family. It becomes entitlement, and entitlement grows sharper and more aggressive the moment you build something it cannot control. Protecting yourself from people who have spent years treating your presence as optional and your resources as available is not a betrayal of love. Peace is not selfishness. Evidence is not cruelty. A locked gate is not an act of hostility. It is simply the physical expression of a decision you should have been allowed to make years earlier. The lesson I carried out of Blackthorn Manor that Christmas was not that I had won, it was that I had finally stopped playing the game by rules that had been written specifically to ensure I would lose. And for the first time in all of my 34 years, Christmas did not feel like the season I got forgotten. It felt like the season I finally got to stay.